On this video, I'm going to be talking about things to consider if you're planning on moving up to a taller than stock tire or if you're thinking about going with an aftermarket wheel. Now, a lot of this video stems from many of the comments that I got when I did an 1150 versus 1250 wide tire video earlier this year. I'll put a link here on the screen if you're curious about that. And one of the interesting things that I feel like is misinterpreted or maybe a bit confused is the idea of a narrow versus wide tire. Now, I consider a narrow truck tire to be really anything 11.5 inches and narrower. Now, the most common sizes you're going to find, especially in the taller 33, 35, and even 37 inch range, is going to be your 1050 and 1150. And there are some real advantages of going with what I would consider a more narrow tire. One of them is that you get to maintain your factory wheel. Now, why that's a big deal is that if you're going to stay with a stock wheel, you're going to get two distinct advantages. Number one, it's going to keep that tire and wheel package underneath the fender of the vehicle, and that's a big deal not only for keeping debris from slinging all over your car, but in many states it's required. So if you have to keep that tire under the wheel for legality reasons, it makes a lot of sense. From an actual performance standpoint, there are advantages. Having a wheel that stays basically as the factory intended means your scrub radius is going to be more ideal. Now, what is scrub radius? We're really just talking about steering, and if you keep that factory wheel as it's intended, it's going to pivot around the ball joints just as that manufacturer designed it to. If you go further away from that, it's going to put more leverage on those ball joints, and it's also going to create issues with wheel bearings depending on how big of a tire that you go with and how much offset or backspacing difference that it has. So going with a stock wheel or staying with a stock wheel with a tall, narrow tire really has some significant benefits. What are the drawbacks to that? Well, you are running a fine line when you keep a factory wheel and move up tire sizes. This is a tough one to sort of discuss in a generalized fashion because there are different challenges for different vehicles. For example, if you have an independent front suspension vehicle, an IFS, F-150 or Chevy Silverado, one of the challenges when you keep a factory wheel is that if you go too wide of a tire, it'll actually touch the upper control arm. So you really get into an issue where it won't even work with going with too wide of a tire. So you're already limited in that realm. Another issue, if you have a solid axle vehicle, say a Ford Super Duty or even a Jeep Wrangler, going with a taller tire that is too wide will do two things. Number one, it'll contact suspension components, whether you have a radius arm or a link style control arm, but you can also get into things like your sway bar or even shocks, depending on what type of vehicle you have and how much taller over stock you've gone with that tire. So while there are many good advantages of going with a stock wheel, there are a lot of things to consider. Now, if you're looking at a tire and you're not really sure if that tire is going to be a good fit for your factory wheel, my best recommendation is to go to that tire manufacturer site, and they will actually recommend the width range for that particular tire. So if you have a 17 by 7.5, for example, and you go and you're considering whether it's a 35 1250 or a 35 1150, it'll tell you on that site, on that manufacturer's website, if that's a good fit, if they recommend it for that ratio. Now, what happens if you run too wide of a tire for what they recommend? Typically, you get into a crowning issue with the tire. You're basically bringing that tire in and it's going to stick further out. Now, there are some off-road advantages to that. You're kind of protecting the wheel a little bit more, and plenty of people run a 1250 on a too narrow wheel, a factory wheel, especially in the Jeep community. That's not that uncommon. The kind of disadvantage of doing that is sometimes you're challenged with trying to get a flat contact pattern with that tire. Part of that is because you are crowning that And when you're trying to play with air pressure to get not only the ideal street pressure, but to make sure that you're not sacrificing any handling, sometimes what happens is you end up having to run a lower street pressure to get a flat contact pattern. And when you do that, you're basically robbing fuel economy, you're robbing a bit of handling performance, braking, acceleration. There are a good bit of negatives to that. So the flip side of that coin is if you are going to do your research and say, I want to stay within that realm, the tire window is a little bit more limited. You've got to go with something typically that's either a 1050 or an 1150. Now, when you're looking at these tires, there are definitely a lot of things to consider, but you have to understand that the way a tire is actually measured, for the most part, not every manufacturer does this, but generally, if you're looking at, let's say, a Nitto tire, you will see that the overall width is actually measured. And it's good to note that the overall width of the tire is not actually the tread width. Overall is measured from the outside of the sidewall to the outside of the sidewall. So if the tire has a really aggressive sidewall, it's actually going to measure wider than if it has a very mild sidewall. And that is very important because the actual top cap of the tire, the tread that's hitting the ground, is usually much narrower. Now this can change wildly from one tire manufacturer to the other. And why that's important is because you will definitely find, insert vehicle here, you've got a guy that says, oh, I put on a 37 1250 and I didn't rub at all. And you have a guy that says, well, I put on a 37 1250 and mine's rubbing all over the inner fender and the upper control arm. It's just because there is a lot of variances between one tire manufacturer to the other. Nitto typically runs very true to size in overall height, but there can be a lot of disparity in the overall width because Nitto tends to run pretty aggressive and bold sidewalls. So that's just something to consider. Sometimes it's better to go to your local discount tire and take a tape measure if they've got some of these in stock, and you'll actually see what the actual tread width is. I wish more tire manufacturers actually listed what the top cap, the actual tread width was, and that overall width, because it's very helpful when trying to determine what tire can actually fit under your vehicle. Now, if you don't want to keep your factory wheel and you want to look at an aftermarket one, but you're not really sure where to start, the best recommendation I can give you is find out what the factory wheel specs are. You're going to be looking at the offset and backspacing. Now, these two often get confused and overlapped. Let's talk about backspacing first. To me, it's a lot easier to navigate when you're looking at tires and wheels when you do know what the backspacing figure is. So let's say from the factory your wheel has 6 inches of backspacing. If you want to go with a wheel that moves it away from the vehicle, so you want to make that tire stick out further, you want to find a wheel that has lower numerical backspacing. So a wheel with 3.5 inches of backspacing is going to stick out further from the vehicle than a wheel with high numerical backspacing, which is, let's say, that 5.5 or 6 inch range. Now, the advantages of going with a lower numerical backspacing is that you are going to get that tire outside of the fender, which sometimes really helps with off-road stability, but it can also help with tire clearance for suspension components. The challenge is when you go to an aftermarket wheel that has a low numerical backspacing and you're sticking it pretty far outside of the vehicle, not only are you going to impact that scrub radius, but it actually changes a bit of that arc for how the tire and wheel travels. And the challenge of that is when you start to get outside of that factory dimension, if you have a very narrow wheel well, you are more likely to contact the outside of the fender or bits of that front bumper, depending on what the application is. So you can actually have more challenges clearing a taller tire when you go with a low numerical backspacing because of how it pushes and changes that arch of the tire. If you don't mind trimming the pinch seam or having the tire rub on the control arm just a little bit, it's okay. It just depends on what you're willing to do. Now, you'd have to manage your expectations on how big of a tire you can fit in general without lifting the vehicle. If you're just looking at moving up to a taller tire size from what you have, the best sort of first thing you should do is go measure your wheel well and get an idea of what type of opening that you have. Take a look at what you already have tire wise, turn the wheel all the way in one way, measure and see what the distance is from that closest point, and that's going to give you a great indicator of how much taller you can go. Width, again, is a bit trickier because of things like your suspension components and what type of vehicle you have, but that's a big part to consider. Now, a wheel with a high negative offset means the tire is going to be pushed away from the vehicle, while a wheel with a positive offset number will be further under the vehicle. Now, the other thing that I have to talk about here is tires. What to consider before upgrading and what sort of tire parameters. Now, I've talked about mud terrain versus all terrain. We've done a lot of tire tech on this channel, but what I want to talk about here are a few things to consider when you are looking at moving up tires. And let's talk about number one, load rating. Load rating is huge. You have to not only make sure you're getting the correct load rating for your vehicle, and what I mean by that is when you have standard load range tires and you have light truck, which is going to have a higher load range, that's really important. Sort of building out your vehicle with the proper sidewall and tire that can support the weight that you're not only, if you're going to be towing or if you're going to be outfitting your vehicle with a lot of aftermarket parts, is critically important. And that's not a hard number to figure out. Again, just go back to that tire manufacturer's website. It'll tell you max PSI. A load range C tire is going to ride a little bit better if you have a lighter vehicle. Same thing with, that's sort of your standard load metrics. It's going to have a bit more compliant sidewall. You're going to get into heavy duty, more stiffer sidewall as you move into that load range D and E and even especially F load, sidewall ratings. And you need that if you're hauling a lot of weight or if your vehicle is really heavy. Those are all things to consider. That is a huge thing you just don't want to skip out and overlook on. Make sure that the tire is load rated correctly. The next thing to really consider is, what are you doing with the vehicle? What do you really need? Realistically, an easy way to determine if a tire is going to make a lot of noise is how big that spacing is between the lugs. Now, there are some all-terrains out there that are pretty aggressive that have larger spacing that aren't terribly loud. A good example of that would be the Recon Grappler. I've got those on a couple vehicles, and I've had them a lot in the past. I really like the Recon. It's one of the lighter all-terrains that are on the market that still has really deep tread blocks and is more true to size. It is worth noting as well that you can get the Recon Grappler in narrower tire sizes designed for stock wheels from like 17 to 20. If you are looking for a narrow tire but you want something more aggressive, the Trail Grappler is a good example, because they do make one of my favorite tire sizes is the 35 by 1150 R17. It's such a great Jeep tire for those that don't want to go with a big lift kit or anything like that, just want to stay 35s and no lift on, let's say, a Willys or a Rubicon model. It works really well for that. I've done a lot of vehicle specific, hey, can you run a 37 no lift on this or that vehicle? So if you are interested in those topics, please consider subscribing to the Driving Line channel. I've got lots of content around tires and upgrades and things like that here. If you've got any questions for me directly, just drop them in the comments, or you can find me at all social media at Ollie Mansour Editor. I appreciate you guys making it to the end of the video and hope to see you on the trail. All right, take care.